George, I wanted to start with you and this book. You've been such an advocate, as Anne has mentioned, for telling our community's history of incarceration and your own personal story. You've written a graphic novel, a musical, but now this is a children's book, a book written in the first person, in the child's voice, in your voice as a child. Could you talk a little bit more about why you chose to write it in this way and chose to write a children's book?
Well, when I experienced the internment, I was a 5-year-old kid. So those are my real memories that I have. But I've written 2 other books on the internment. One was an autobiography that I tell as an adult, and I certainly include my childhood years as well. But that was a general book, aimed at the general public. But I'm always surprised when people come up to me and I tell them about my childhood imprisonment. They are shocked that such a thing happened. Many Americans don't know our American history. Yes, it's a tiny chapter, but it's a critically important chapter. And if this story is not to be remembered, it is a serious concern. And so I decided I'm going to have another crack at it. When I was a teenager, I loved comic books, visual storytelling. And I thought there's this new genre called a graphic novel. But I thought I'd do a graphic memoir targeting the teenagers, because they're the ones that are going to be developing our future. And I want them to know about American history. And so I did it as a graphic memoir titled They Called Us Enemy, which is what they called us. We weren't the enemy, and they also tagged on alien. We weren't alien. And that just underscores the irrationality of the internment. But then, and that's still selling well. It's still on the New York Times bestseller list. They Called Us Enemy. Thank you for the support, all of you. But I thought my real memory is that of when I was a 5-year-old, when we were incarcerated. And I remember as a teenager, I wanted to understand. I remember the experience, but I really didn't understand it. It was terrifying, it was chaotic, it was constant being moved about, and I wanted to understand why that was, because I learned in school that we have a Bill of Rights, we have a Constitution, we have a system of due process, and so I wanted this to be known to a younger child. Well, I thought with one book I'd aim at 2 generations, the parents and the kiddies that they read to, and hence a children's picture book with the help of this very talented artist, Michelle. And that's why we have it as a picture book.
I mean, I think with that, Michelle, getting such a story, you say in your bio that you felt a resonance with this story, but I wanted to know kind of your initial reaction to working with this and bringing such a tough, really scary and horrible time for a lot of people to life in a story that is simultaneously so personal, so universal, and also illustrates such an iconic figure as George, but also tell this vulnerable story.
Yeah, so I guess, first of all, my initial reaction when I learned that I was going to be working on this project was like shock, and then a little bit of panic, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is the George Takei. But then I had to remember that before he was the George Takei, he was a 5-year-old boy who encountered all this hardship with his family. And so that was kind of the avenue through which I was approaching it. And there were these very sort of like universal themes that I wanted to connect with. You know, I think my background is very different from George in a certain sense, but I was connecting on the aspect of like, oh, he's from LA, I'm from LA. That's great. He went to Berkeley for a little bit. You know, there were these kind of biographical things that I found a connection to, and then was able to sort of make it more universal. You know, when the story came to me, it was about towards the end of COVID. It was 2022, and of course during that time, you know, these sentiments that were happening 80 years ago that led to the incarceration of Japanese Americans was then repeating itself as anti-Asian violence, and so it felt very sort of personal to do justice to this story and have it come out into the world, and it just felt timely in a very kind of sad way, you know.
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, I think we talked briefly about it, but you put a lot of research into making this book happen.
Yeah.
So I'd love if both of you could talk about that process, about coming here to the museum, to our archives to create the story, and just talk about the research that you both did and the collaboration you did to make this book happen.
Well, so when we first got the story, George invited me to JANM. We had lunch in Little Tokyo, and then we came to the museum, and he and Lynn Yamasaki, they showed me around, and we went to the exhibits, and George shared more about his story and his background. And, you know, the museum itself, Lynn set me up with some DVDs that were specific about Rohwer, the camp where George and his family were sent initially. And the digital archives were just a constant source for me to pull from. And I think it was really important to listen to other people's oral histories and just get a sense of this environment that was happening. You know, this is George's story. This book is George's story, but it's also happening with so many other families and citizens who are, you know, going through the same thing and maybe experiencing it very differently. You know, so it was important to have this kind of overview in the back of my mind as I was painting this very specific story. What else?
Well, I think your artistry is an artistry that's rich with compassion and humanity. And my favorite of your drawings is the one at the back of the book. If you hold it, it's a scene from Rohwer, Arkansas. We were incarcerated all camps were in the most isolated, desolate, and god-awful places. Many of you, the people with gray hair or no hair, remember camp. Some of you were in the blistering hot desert of Arizona, or others were in the cold, windswept high plains of Wyoming, Idaho, Utah, Colorado, and we were in the swamps of Arkansas with insects and water moccasins and all sorts of danger there. And what Michelle did was capture the ominous threat, framing the big giant trees that grow out of the muck. I'm a Southern Californian kid. I know palm trees, but not trees that grow out of black mucky water. And so she captured the threat, the ominous, the dangerous, and framed the picture with those dark trees, and then captures my brother Henry and me in bright sunshine playing, catching butterflies and catching pollywogs in the creek there. And we're in bright sunshine, but you also see the barbed wire fence. She tells so much of the story and still captures the humanity of two young boys. And my worried mother, she was always saying, "Abunai, abunai," dangerous, dangerous, don't do anything. And of course, you can't keep a 5-year-old or 4-year-old still. And so there we were worrying her, and there's our baby sister, Reiko, holding her hand. And it's a lovely picture that also suggests the ominous. And on the other flip side, right here, is another tree and capturing the sentry tower with the stern-looking soldier in the tower. I think it does so much, and that's what artistry is, to imbue more than just a photograph, but the human emotion, the differing emotions. My mother's anxiety, our playing in the sunshine, and the physical threat of the swamp and the barbed wire fence.
Yeah, I think that spread is such a great example of how complicated it was, and against the backdrop of incarceration and just like oppression and being uprooted, there's still at the end of it, he's a 5-year-old kid doing what kids do, and looking in the drainage ditch and finding little creepy crawlies that his mother is not into, but this is the thing that he finds a lot of joy in. And so I think as the illustrator is looking for those moments where the childlike wonder, I think, was not lost despite all of the circumstances.
You mentioned your mom and how she's in this illustration, but when I was reading this book, it felt like such a love letter, such a honor to, or a honoring of your parents. And I would love if you could talk a little bit about writing about them from the perspective of a child, and how your parents and their actions during World War II that you talk about inspired you.
Well, I really consider my parents my American heroes. When we arrived there, well, before we arrived, we were in Santa Anita, and that was a shock. We had a 2-bedroom home, backyard, front yard, and we were ordered out of that home by 2 soldiers who carried rifles with shiny bayonets on them, and when they first banged on the door and my father answered it, one of the soldiers pointed his bayonet at our father. Henry and I were there in the living room, and we were frozen with terror. I mean, it was a horrific experience, memory that I have from the very beginning. But then we were taken to the horse stalls of Santa Anita. The stench of horse manure was overpowering, and there were insects skittering around on the ground, flies buzzing in the air. Our baby sister immediately got sick. She was a baby, literally. And 3 days later, I got sick too. And my mother, under those circumstances, nursed us back to health. She was heroic. We were taken on a 3-day, 2-night journey to the farthest camp, farthest eastern camp of the 10 camps, a few miles from the Mississippi River. And there, my mother took over making that raw black tar paper and a raw wood barrack into a home for us. she collected rags, washed them, and then tore them into strips and braided them into, we have it, or do we have an image? Into a rug so that our feet can have something soft and warm in that. And she got our neighbor, who was had a talent for woodworking, and had him make little tiny children's chairs and that table there. And she put our whole family in danger by smuggling in contraband. We were not supposed to bring sharp-pointed instruments or sharp edges or anything mechanical. My mother knew that, but she knew that she had 3 fast-growing children. And so she wrapped the portable sewing machine in baby blanket, my sister's baby blankets and sweaters, and then packed on top of it animal cracker boxes, Cracker Jack, lollipops, a picture book for Daddy to read to us as a little decoy. And she lugged that huge duffel bag right in front of these threatening, big, burly U.S. Soldiers, all the way from Los Angeles to Arkansas, 2/3 of the way across the country. And when we arrived there and she revealed it to us, my father was aghast. If the soldiers knew anything about this, what's going to happen to us, the whole family? And he was in shock and concerned. But my mother kept saying, children will be needing new clothes. We have to make new clothes for the children. And then he started to giggle, and then he burst into a totally uncontrolled, guffawing laughter. But my mother had that kind of guts as well. She was in charge of the little unit that we had in the barracks. But my father, he spoke both Japanese and English fluently. And so he was able to communicate with the immigrant generation as well as the English-speaking younger generation, American-born generation. And so, and my father was a volunteer at Rohwer. It was recovered swampland. Trees were cut down, the water was drained. But when it rained, it went right back into becoming a swamp. And elderly people couldn't make it to the mess hall 3 times a day. Their feet would sink into the muck, and their legs didn't have the strength to pull it out. And now, at 87, I know what it was like. Their legs were weak. So young guys had to carry elderly people on their back. And of course, with that weight, their feet sunk in deep, but they were strong enough to pull it out and bring elderly people to the mess hall. My father suggested building a boardwalk connecting every unit to the mess hall. And with her research for accuracy, I'm sure she got all the measurement right too. They were narrow boardwalks, but they connected every one of the units in our block to the mess hall, and where you get rid of it as well, the latrine. So they were both heroic. My father settled the problems within the block, or dealt with the camp administration, and when they had announcements to be made, he was making announcements or speeches at the meal times in the mess hall. So it was their example for me while we were children And then later on, when I was a teenager, I went to the school library and couldn't find anything about the internment. And so my only source was my father. And he was one of the few fathers of his generation who talked to me about what it was like in camp. He told me about his anguish. He said, just like in that picture of Henry and me playing in the sunlight, he would see us playing there, and from a distance he said he had so much hope for his two boys, what they're going to do. But behind barbed wire fence, it tore him apart to know what our future is going to be. It was a painful experience, he told me. And in writing about it, and remembering what he told me when I was a teenager, I found myself at the computer sobbing. Memory can be painful as well. And it wasn't my memory, it was my father's memory that I was echoing. So pictures are so important. And the anguish that my parents went through, that they survived and raised my brother and sister and me to be who we are today. My brother is a retired periodontist, dentist. My sister is a retired teacher. I'm the oldest in the family, and I'm the black sheep of the family. I'm an actor, and I'm still working, the only one.
I guess we're coming close to the end and almost going to open up to audience questions. But Michelle, you know, George talks about how his parents made things good for them, for these kids in a difficult time, in a scary time. And you had to take the difficult task of taking a difficult, scary time and making it accessible for a young audience. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you took these stories and what your thought process was with that? Yeah.
I mean, I think hearing George talk about his story in person, there is just so many more details that didn't make it into the book, you know, and that this is just one man who was 5, you know, and multiply that by however many people, you know. So I think in the text that I received from George, there were a lot of stories where he does sort of highlight those moments where things were new or fun or exciting, in addition to the times when he noticed when his parents were stressed out or crying or angry. Like, as a 5-year-old kid, he was picking up on everything that was going on around him, even though he may not have understood exactly what was happening, you know? So I think as an illustrator, it was my job to show those high points, to show the sad points, to show those uncertain points. And so, like, in the, you know, initially when they get sent to Santa Anita, I think the text is something like, you know, his parents are just humiliated by this, you know, having to sleep in a horse stall where there's manure, it still smells, there's bugs. And he's just like, wow, this is so fun. We get to sleep where the horses slept, you know? And so I think that's just a very accessible point for kids, you know? Like, that is just what a 5-year-old was thinking. So there are these moments throughout that just show how protective his parents were in kind of like creating a very safe environment, at least in their family unit, where he and his brother and sister were able to sort of be kids and enjoy things in the way that kids would. So the snowball fight, and like seeing snow for the first time, and having Christmas, getting to experience Christmas at Rohwer, and eventually finding a dog, Blackie, at Tule Lake, and all the kind of hijinks that arise from owning a dog. And so those were the moments where I think it was important to show that, like, against this backdrop, this is still the story of someone who was a child and kind of the resilience that came about because of his parents and his family and the community at large. Yeah.
Yeah, I loved, as someone who has a large black dog, I loved that part of the book. You write in your introduction that you wish that you hope that this book, you write this book on the wish that my childhood friendship with Donald, who was a friend you had, who was white and looked different than you, but you were close friends, could have grown up to be the same kind of bond you enjoyed in the future world of Star Trek. And you talk about that in an infinite diversity of infinite combinations. And I would love to hear more about your hopes for this book and how it's impacting people and how it's doing that work that you talk about of increasing diversity and an understanding of each other.
Well, I was very lucky in landing a show like Star Trek, whose creator, Gene Roddenberry, was, like my parents in a different way, an extraordinary person. He was Air Force pilot during the war, and then after the war, he wanted to be a television writer, so he came to Los Angeles, but he had a child by then, and he needed a steady job. So he worked as a policeman. He got hired as a policeman, and he had a partner, and his district was this area, downtown, the north downtown area. Gene Roddenberry was a foot patrolman together with one of the first African Americans to become a policeman named Tom Bradley, the future mayor of Los Angeles. And so they shared a common simpatico. And when he became a successful writer, television writer, selling scripts, he wanted to deal with the turbulent times of the 1960s. 60s was when the civil rights movement was going on. People peacefully demonstrating for equality, African Americans, and law enforcement officers attacking them with attack dogs and fire hoses. The opposite of what law enforcement should be about. They should have been protecting him. And that 60s was also a time of the Vietnam War. And this nation was split in two. One group fiercely determined to support the war, and another group peacefully demonstrating for peace. And that was tearing the country apart. And the peace movement people were mostly young college people, and police officers were attacking these young people, and one of them got shot and killed in Ohio. Rich drama for a playwright or a television writer, and he couldn't write about it because television is an advertising medium. So he said, and he's a creative guy, he said, I'm going to put the story in the future and use metaphor as the way of telling that story. The Starship Enterprise, round like this blue planet here, Starship Earth, is made up of a lot of different people. And he felt it was the diversity of this planet that contributed to the strength of this planet. People of different backgrounds, people of different experiences, people of different faiths, all coming together and working together, sharing their unique experiences and vantage point. And that's what made it possible for the Starship Enterprise to boldly go where no one had gone before. That was the theme, and I was lucky enough to be cast for the Asian character. There was the captain was from North America, the engineer was from Europe, a Scotsman, the ship's doctor was from the American South, and Africa was represented by a black woman, and that whole vast diverse area of Asia was to be represented by the character I was to play. But he had a problem with the Asian character. Asia has a great varied diversity, and every Asian surname, his challenge was finding a name for this Asian character. Every Asian surname is nationally specific. Tanaka is Japanese, Wang is Chinese, Lee is Korean, and 20th century Asia was turbulent with warfare, colonization, rebellion, and so forth. And he didn't want to suggest that. He wanted to find a pan-Asian name. And he had a map of Asia pinned on his wall, office wall, and he was staring at it. And he saw off the coast of the Philippines the Sulu Sea. And he thought, the waters of a sea touch all shores. And that's how my character came to be called Sulu. But since he cast a Japanese American in that role, he found the Japanese first name for him, Hikaru, which means shining light. And that's how I came to be associated with Star Trek. And I believe that in that philosophy, America's strength is in its diversity coming together and working in concert. And yet today, now, we face a time not unlike the Second World War, when war hysteria and race prejudice and the political leadership being swept up by that kind of hysteria made it possible for them to incarcerate innocent people who had nothing to do with Pearl Harbor other than looking like the people that bombed Pearl Harbor. And so this story from 80 plus years ago, has powerful, profound relevance to our times today. We're living through the same kind of hysteria and racism in our times.
Thank you so much. Yes. I'm actually going to open it up to audience questions, so we're going to run a mic around. I just want to say a quick and friendly reminder, if we can keep our questions short and try to keep them to questions around what we talked about today. We have lots of people in the audience, so we want to make sure we can get to as many as we can. So if you want to raise your hand, Elizabeth will run the mic around to the audience. Oh, maybe start here with Wendy.
Thank you. George and Michelle, thank you for bringing this beautiful book to us. George, you had the honor of being featured in Ali Velshie's banned book club for They Called Us Enemy. And I'd love it if you could share that experience with us. And my question is whether you expect to be a repeat guest for My Lost Freedom.
Well, so far, My Lost Freedom, which went on sale last Tuesday, hasn't been banned yet. Yes, my previous book, They Called Us Enemy, was banned in York, Pennsylvania. Some of those cities have library boards or school boards that's made up of people who don't have much spine. If people go to their board meetings and yell and scream and and gesticulate broadly enough, the board caves, and they acquiesce to the people who have complaints. Many of those are minority, small numbers of people, not representative of that community, but they have loud mouths and shrill voices. And the library board caved. But because I have a lot of Star Trek fans who go out and immediately buy books, they had read the book before it got banned, and they said, this isn't something that should be banned. And so Star Trek fans are organizers as well. They organized, went down to the next library board meeting, and they knew who was going to talk first, second, third, fourth. The whole group had their time at the mic, and they explained why this book needs to be available to everybody. Not this book, but They Called Us Enemy. It needs to be available to everybody because it's an important American story. And the board again caved, and in York, Pennsylvania, now you can buy They Called Us Enemy, and hopefully they also buy a lot of My Lost Freedom.
We have some audiences. And I guess I can take this chance to remind you that you can also buy They Called Us Enemy in the JANM Store. So if you want to get a copy today.
Hi, over here.
He's up there.
Hey, George.
Hi.
I'm wondering what became of this sewing machine that your mother snuck in. Was it ever discovered? Did they take it back home with them after you all were released as a family? Do you know where it is now?
The sewing machine traveled with us. From Rohwer, we were transferred to Tule Lake, the segregation camp, the most militarized. We were in the farthest east camp, and from there we were taken to the most militarized, high security camp called the segregation camp for disloyals, and that's a whole story in itself there about my parents being categorized as disloyal. That was also the most populous, the biggest of all the camps. There were 10 camps. Most camps had anywhere from 6,000 to 13,000 people. Tule Lake had 18,000 people, and it was the most militarized. Most camps, all camps, had just one barbed wire fence. Tule Lake had 3 layers of barbed wire fence. Most camp had sentry towers and an armed soldier standing guard. At Tule Lake, all the sentry towers had the armed soldier, but also machine guns installed aimed at us. Innocent people who had nothing to do with Pearl Harbor, but this was the overreaction. And to really top it all, Tule Lake had 6 tanks patrolling the perimeter. Tanks are vehicles that belong on a battlefield, not rumbling around, intimidating and goading people that are already seething with rage and gritting their teeth. It was truly a militarized camp, and we were sent there from Rohwer in Arkansas.
Yeah, we have.
Did the sewing machine make it back to
yes.
LA with you then? I'm curious too.
Sorry,
Everyone's waiting.
I give you too much detail and lose the point of. We had it with us all the way, and we brought it back to Los Angeles, and so much of what we brought from camp after my father passed, my mother put in the garage, and we can't find it. It's in the garage, my mother's garage anymore. Somehow it disappeared.
We have another question up at the top here.
Okay, Mr. Takei, I have a question.
Where are you?
You said
He's up at the very top of the...
you said your mother was born in Florence, but there were no hospitals in Florence. And was your mother born in a hospital in Sacramento? And explain why not.
I didn't know those details. Florence probably did not have a hospital. It was a rural farming area that was attached. Eventually became a part of Sacramento. So probably either the hospital in Sacramento or they had Japanese midwives in the communities. And so she could have been born via a midwife. But I don't know for sure.
I believe she was born with a midwife because they would not let Japanese in the Sacramento hospitals. I know that for
I
a
think you're
fact.
right, because my mother's cousin once pointed out to me when we were visiting relatives in that area. He said, that's the school for the white people, white kids, and that's the school for Asian and Latino kids. They had segregated education in rural California. And so the rural part of California back in those days, my mother was born in 1912, was not that different from the rural South that's famous for segregated schools. We had segregated schools in California, and I think you're right. They probably had segregated hospitals too.
I think we have time for about one more questions for Michelle and George. So.
Hi, George. My name is Hiro Kato. I'm from Japan. I grew up watching Star Trek, and it's really shaped who I am today. So, really in awe of your presence. Just wanted to ask. So I have 3 boys right here who's with me. They go to school in Orange County, and I see some of the kind of social activisms that appear to happen through a lot of the misinformation that is out there, and I'm just wondering your thoughts on that.
Say that again. No.
The social activism that occurs based on a lot of the misinformation or false information that is out there, and I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that and how we can advise our kids.
What the point that you make about misinformation or disinformation is, I think, a relatively new phenomenon brought about by technology. I grew up in an innocent age. It's either good or bad, or bad was disguised. The internment of innocent Japanese Americans was bad, but they disguised it with a lot of euphemisms. We were taken to a relocation center or a rural community. They didn't refer to the soldiers or the barbed wire fence at all. It sounded like we were. As a matter of fact, we are at a very historic spot. The building, the brick building next door, used to be a Buddhist temple, the Nishihonganji Buddhist temple. And when Executive Order 9066, the relocation internment order came down, we were picked up at our homes, as I told you, by soldiers, and brought here, right to in front of that Buddhist temple with the classic ceremonial canopy over it. And this street in front and First Street was massed with Japanese Americans with their luggage. The museum has a photo of people massed there. Did you get to see that photo? So this is a historic spot. The building next door is a historic landmark. And you know, I ramble. Your question was based on misinformation. Yeah. We were incarcerated not only on misinformation, but disinformation. We were characterized as enemy alien. They didn't have, we have a system called due process. When you're arrested, you have a right to know what the charges are. And once you find out what the charges are, you have the right as a citizen to challenge the charge. And so you have a right to have a trial with a lawyer now. And then if they come up with the facts, the evidence behind the charge, and they're true, then you're punished. In our case, they had no evidence or anything to justify their position, so they had no charge. They just had a categorization. We were categorized as enemy alien, which was ridiculous because we were neither. We were not the enemy, and we were not aliens. We were American born. And so hysteria and racism can cause a great violation of our American due process system.
Thank you. I think we're about at time, but I do want to just ask, I know we have some kids in the audience, so if any of the kids have a question, I want to make sure we get to those. But I'm just seeing some waves. If not, I'll ask for some final comments. Oh, I saw you wave your hands. No? Okay. Well, you can ask some afterwards. I know, I'm sorry we can't get to everyone. We will be doing a signing, so I really appreciate you coming here, and I appreciate you all sharing. Do you have any last thoughts on this book, on this process, from either of you?
I mean, I think just this book, I really hope that it's a tool for families, for teachers, for anyone to, lead to more discussions, right? The gentleman who asked the question about misinformation, I think it's just really important to talk about things with people, with the institutions around us, and like people who know what's going on. I just hope that this book, My Lost Freedom, even though it happened 80 years ago, the messages are going to
80 years.
80 years. What did I say? 80 years ago. The message is, the problems that led to this are always going to be like recurring, I think, sadly. So, yeah, that's my hope for this book, is that it just leads to more discussion.